Hello again. So now I want to spend a little time talking about body cavities. Body cavities are a way that we can divide the human body on the inside for the purpose of structural organization, as well as two really critical functions. Function number one is to protect delicate organs. So things like the liver, the spleen, the heart, all those things, if they were to sustain some sort of blunt impact, it could be damaging to the cell structures as well as the bigger things like the tissues. And so we really want to make sure that we have sort of a barrier between anything that may be external and actually those organs. In addition, we like to permit significant changes in the size and the shape of the internal organs. So this is things like with every single breath that you take, your lungs are going to expand, and we need those lungs to change physical size in order to take the air in. Additionally, things like abdominal distension after a large meal corresponds to expansion of the stomach and the intestines to accommodate the now food that's being digested and absorbed into the body that wasn't there before. So we basically can consider ventral body cavities and dorsal body cavities. Earlier when we were talking about the ventral versus dorsal directional terminology, the example that we highlighted was ventral versus dorsal body cavities. So here they are. Here we get to spend a little time talking about them in more detail. The ventral body cavities are the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. And some books or some resources will combine the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity and just call it the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that's not wrong either. We're going to talk about them independently for now, but there'll be some useful times to consider them as a combined whole. And further breakdown of the thoracic cavity includes the pericardial cavity and pleural cavities. Further breakdown of the abdominal cavity includes the peritoneal cavity. So we're going to talk more about those shortly. Additionally, the dorsal body cavities are the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. And I just want to draw for you and sort of give you a good idea of what exactly we're talking about when we talk about these cavities. So here's my human body side profile, and the cranial cavity houses the brain. So pretty much everything within the cranial bones is considered part of the insides of the cranial cavity. The spinal cavity houses the spinal cord, and pretty much anything within the vertebral space where the spinal cord passes is considered the spinal cavity. Notice that I've also drawn the dorsal fin to remind you that dorsal is the spinal side of the body. Now, also, let's talk about where the other cavities are. So the thoracic cavity basically is the chest cavity contains the heart, the lungs, and the mediastinum, which is basically the heart, the great vessels, so the aorta and the inferior superior vena cava, the esophagus, the trachea, the phrenic nerve, the thoracic duct, which belongs as it's part of the lymphatic system, the thymus, which is also part of the lymphatic system, and some other things. We're getting kind of a long list there, but some of the things that basically are found in that area. The pericardial cavity specifically contains the heart. The pleural cavities, there are two of them, each one contains a lung. And then our abdominal cavity, the peritoneal cavity, contains all of the abdominal organs. So that's going to be things like the large and small intestine and the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder. So those are the basic ones that I want to talk about for now. One thing that I do want to talk about briefly is the fact that the kidneys and also the pancreas and the duodenum, which is one of the sections of the small intestine, are considered retroperitoneal. So if you've never heard that word before, it just means behind, retro meaning behind the peritoneal cavity. And it's important to know that those organs are not considered part of, they're not contained within the peritoneal cavity. So we don't technically call them abdominal organs. And there will be some instances where we'll talk about the specifics of those, and I do want you to know where they are. The pelvic cavity contains reproductive organs, and as I mentioned before, is closely connected to the abdominal cavity. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about what is inside of these cavities. There are these things called serous membranes, And there are serous membrane basically means that there's two layers. It's two layers of membrane that, and we're going to expand on this topic quite a bit when we talk about, I believe it's in the tissue section where it's going to come up again, and there'll be a more detailed definition of it. But for now, think of it as just sort of a lining, and there are two parts of the lining. There's the visceral lining, and then there's the parietal lining, and the two linings are separated by some fluid, which we call serous fluid. So in this drawing, I want to just talk a little bit about, this is one example of a body cavity. So this is the pericardial cavity that I'm drawing. So the pericardial cavity is lined by the parietal membrane. So in this particular case, we'll call it the parietal pericardium. So you'll refer to the name, whichever visceral or parietal, and then you'll match it with whatever particular cavity it's referring to. So the parietal membrane lines the inside of the cavity, and then the visceral membrane, or the visceral pericardium, is sort of like, it's almost like saran wrap around the specific organ. In this case, it's the heart. So the visceral pericardium refers to the heart, a lining around the heart. It's basically like saran wrap right around it. So think almost like a layer of saran wrap, and then you could put like a thin layer of water, and then you could say that the next lining is the parietal lining, and that actually surrounds or just lines the inside of the cavity. So I know this concept is a little abstract, so be patient with it. Try to imagine. There are a lot of examples in textbooks where they basically will say, like, take your fist and sort of put it into a blown up balloon, and if you can imagine that, one piece of the balloon is actually going to be connected to the fist, and then the other piece of the balloon will be separated by air. And if you could just imagine that, but instead there's going to be water on the inside, then you can think of it in terms of there being, just a little bit of a separation between the two linings. Now, I do want to expand a little bit in terms of the purpose of the linings. So the linings themselves are just sort of coverings, but the critical function here is the presence of the fluid in between. So we mentioned the two functions of body cavities. One, to protect delicate organs. So here we basically have, this the organ surrounded by a layer of fluid that it essentially can function as a shock absorber. So if there's any sort of impact, then the fluid will move around before the organ is going to be hit or damaged, especially if it's, relatively minor. The second function that we talked about is the movement of the organ and its ability to change size and shape. So we know that the heart is its function is to pump blood, so it's going to be beating. So it's going to expand and contract. It's going to get bigger and smaller, bigger and smaller, bigger and smaller, bigger and smaller. And as it does, it's moving around inside of that cavity. So the visceral membrane is adhered to the heart, so it's moving with the heart. But the parietal membrane really isn't moving. And so the fluid in between essentially is going to prevent any generation of friction, so if the linings are rubbing against each other, they're going to generate friction. But because there's a separation of fluid in between, it makes it just a very smooth transition, smooth movement in between the two linings. So that offers, basically, those are the two benefits right there. So the things being housed inside of the cavity, for one, can be, protected by things like bones and muscles. But in addition to that, these serous membranes that are separated by some fluid really drive home these functions of the body cavities. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about the abdomen. And I think that for the most part, if we were to discuss like some of the major organs that are found in the body, most people I think know where the heart, the lungs, the brain, like those big things are. But it's important to make sure that we have a good understanding of where all the abdominal organs are, just to sort of get us started and be on the same page about it. So I'm just going to try to put them into context here. This drawing is, and most of, what I'm going to draw really will be, unless it's stick figure and kind of facing in profile view, we're going to always assume that these drawings are in anatomical position. So this is the patient facing you. And so on the right side of the screen is the patient's left side, and on the left side of the screen is the patient's right side. So it's something that if you're not used to it, you're just gonna have to get used to it a little bit. And I'll try to label the drawings always. In this case, I'm going to label the quadrants so you'll know. But in the future, I'll try to make sure I label as well. So let's just talk about what the organs are. So first of all, you can see the large and small intestine. Large intestine sort of surrounds the small intestine, and it's just a nice sort of upside down U shape. The liver sits on the right side and is above the large intestine, so in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen. The gallbladder sits sort of like tucked underneath the liver, and when we do dissection, we'll be able to see that, I think, a little more clearly. But for now, you're just gonna have to trust me that that's where it is. The stomach on the other side, and the spleen is sort of lateral, but almost behind the stomach. And in a normal healthy adult, you really shouldn't be able to palpate the spleen, but if there is any sort of splenomegaly, the spleen is bigger than it's supposed to be, whether it's because of something like mono, some type of disease like that, or if there's a collection of blood there where it shouldn't be for a variety of reasons, then it could be bigger. So the abdomen, I'm sure can be divided into 4 quadrants: the right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, and left lower quadrant. Make sure that you write the letters in the correct order if you're writing the abbreviation. And the intersection between the 4 quadrants occurs at the umbilicus, or the belly button. And so I just want to point out really quickly on this drawing that for one thing, the large and small intestine, and it's not the most perfect drawing that ever existed, but the large and small intestine are above the umbilicus as well as below. So understand those structures to sort of be present in all 4 quadrants. I think that it's pretty well accepted in any EMT class that you would know the 4 quadrants of the abdomen, but you may or may not know that there are also 9 regions. So another way of dividing the abdomen is the 9 regions. And I bring this up for one specific reason. I'm not going to expect, memorization of the names of the regions. There's not very many instances in EMS that we are going to refer to the left lumbar region of the abdomen. Most people don't talk about it like that. They say right upper quadrant, left lower quadrant, or whatever. But what I do want to mention is that one of the 9 regions is the epigastric region. And epigastric, you may or may not know, is sort of an angina equivalent for chest pain. So if you encounter a patient who's complaining of epigastric pain, it's important to think of that, especially if they're of age, as, in the same category as them complaining of chest pain. But I just want to point out, because this is something that wasn't obvious to me until I actually saw that there were 9 regions of the abdomen. The epigastric region is not this arbitrary thing that just people talk about when they really mean chest pain. It actually is the middle upper region of the abdomen when it's divided just that way. So it is a specific location. And so whenever the patient says epigastric pain, you really know that it actually is abdominal pain, but that there are many instances of abdominal pain above the umbilicus that we would, consider to be a possibility of anginal equivalent for concern for, some sort of cardiac issue. And especially epigastric, it's especially in a female, it's almost the same thing as counting them as a chest pain patient. So obviously the complaint is different, but the concerns are the same, and so it's just sort of worth knowing. All right, that's it for body cavities. Thanks for watching.